It's not always easy to recognize. It may look like this, or like this. It may be a burden, but it is a responsibility that we embrace nonetheless. But if it means this for one person and this for someone else, maybe it ultimately means being there for one another. It isn't handed to us, but we know where to find it and how it feels, how it tastes, and what it sounds like when we finally have it. It means different things to different people, but for many, it means everything. And if we all fight for it, it will eventually bring us together.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Power, Propaganda, and the Press, today's discussion hosted by the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom. My name is Matthew Reisha Cruz, and I'm going to be your moderator for today. I'm an alumnus of the FNF study program, and I'm currently an investigative reporting fellow at Columbia University here in New York. I have my coffee with me. It's late at night here, but I'm sure that I will have no trouble staying alert. FNF has assembled an incredible panel for today's discussion, and I'm looking forward to a very robust webinar. So today's event is part of the hashtag Freedom Fights Fake campaign of FNF. This is a campaign that seeks to empower citizens around the globe to think critically to counter disinformation. FNF hopes that you can stay with us until the end of the discussion, where I'm told there will be an exciting announcement from the organization. So before we start, we'd just like to mention some house rules. First of all, you will be muted during the discussion. Please use the chat box to address the panelists and the Q&A box for your questions. Please answer the poll after the program, and streaming will also be available via Facebook Live at FNF Philippines. It's all about freedom. And viewers can also enter their questions in the comment box on Facebook, and we will be sure to address those later on during the Q&A portion. So to formally open the program, I'd like to invite FNF Philippines Head of Country, Mr. Wolfgang Heinz, to say a few words. Wolfgang?
Hi, thanks so much, Matthew, for the introduction and the moderation. And thank you so much more because you're doing that late at night from the United States. Thanks for joining us on this one. I just saw the video and I just realized something. Well, my name is Wolfgang Heinze, and I'm from the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, Head of Country here in the Philippines. And the foundation is called Friedrich Naumann Stiftung in German, für die Freiheit. And Freiheit, and that word you saw at the end, actually means freedom for those who don't know it yet. And it's very much about freedom today, as we are, celebrating Bonifacio Day today. Andres Bonifacio was the founder of Katipunan, and he was one of those great Philippine heroes who really, with courage and grit, fought for the independence of the Philippines. And we felt that today might be a very good day to also celebrate another important part of democracy everywhere worldwide, and that is the freedom of the press. As many of you know, the press is seen as the fifth column or pillar in a working democracy. And we believe that, when we look at press, they are most vital in ensuring democracy because they make sure that there is independent and critical and maybe not always easy reporting for those in power. But that's very important. It's very important to have people who speak truth to power. It is very important that that it is an organized and institutionalized process. And we believe that worldwide, if you have a functioning democracy, it is only with a functioning press that it really works. So we are here today to talk about power. We talk about propaganda and the free press and how that all fits together. Now, you saw that we are a German foundation, a German political foundation. And some of you may wonder, what is a German foundation doing in the Philippines? And actually, I try to keep that one short. We, as a German foundation, we started after the Second World War. And the reason why we exist is because we Germans, had very great difficulties in having democracy in our own country. So after the Second World War, after the millions of people that we killed, I think it's about 15 million people that we really killed, not in war, but through a very systematic process of gassing and people. Basically, we realized the hard way that democracy is not something that is just a system. It is, and it lives, and it will die with the people that support it. For democracy to thrive, you need Democrats. And we in Germany therefore started to have the foundations. Each foundation is close to a political party. And what we are trying to do is we're trying to keep through trainings, through discussions like these, to keep the democratic process alive, the democratic discussion, do trainings on democracy so that citizens can be true Democrats. And in everyday life, know what this more democracy stands for. And up to this day, you saw that we work in about 60 different countries worldwide. Up to this day, actually more than 50% of our funding actually goes into democracy trainings, democracy discussions within Germany. So most of our focus is actually still on Germany, but we are working, as you heard, in many different countries. And we've been here in the Philippines for more than 30 years now. So this is why we're doing and what we're doing. I would like to thank all of you, Matthew, who's now in late night US, but also the others, all the esteemed journalists today that are here for this discussion, because this is one of the big and important discussions on the role of media for me, and the other forces that are also in play when it comes to the public debate, which is most important because it really forms the public opinion. So I'm very much looking forward to all of you. Thank you so much, Matthew, for being here. Thank you so much to all the journalists, of course, for this discussion. And of course, thank you to Danica and all my colleagues who are working hard and tirelessly behind the background, in the background. Thank you so much. Wishing us all a lot of success today.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang. So like I mentioned earlier, FNF has put together an excellent lineup of speakers today. So they are journalists, editors, newsroom leaders, all of whom are doing some really incredible, bold reporting at this extraordinary moment for journalism and for democracy at large. Before we start, could I ask each of the panelists to give just a brief introduction of who you are, where you work, and what the focus of your work is? Maybe in the order that you're appearing on my screen now. So Gemma, Celine, Camille, Mike, then Marijo.
Hi, I'm Gemma Mendoza. I am head for digital strategy at Rappler and previously led the fact check team, but now I'm mostly looking at the digital landscape and how that's shaping journalism. In that capacity, I lead the Rappler's research and efforts in relation to misinformation and disinformation in the digital space.
Hi, I'm Celine. I'm a writer and editor for Vera Files. So we are a nonprofit media organization that does in-depth reporting, which includes fact-checking. So I lead the team that does fact-checking of online mis and disinformation, and we do it as a third-party fact-checking partner of Facebook.
Hello, I'm Camille. I lead the newsroom for Philstar.com, which is a digital counterpart of the Philippine Star, the broadsheet. But we do have a different hierarchy and a different company. And so we also have, I run the day-to-day operations of the newsroom and also direct the general editorial strategy. I handle everything from not just news, but also lifestyle, sports across all sections. And also our reporting on different platforms, social media, video, multimedia. Uh, that's my, this is a huge responsibility.
Mike? I think you're on mute, Mike.
Yes. Hi, good morning. Good evening, Matt. I'm Mike Navallo. I'm a reporter for ABS-CBN News. I cover the Justice Beat. This year, unfortunately, it included covering the shutdown of the ABS-CBN.
Hi, good morning, and nice to see you, Matthew. I am Mary Jo Ramos. I'm covering transport and mobility beats for the Philippine Daily Inquirer. But I've also worked on special reports concerning social justice and human rights.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again to all of our panelists for being here. So just to kick off the discussion on disinformation, there's been a very interesting debate recently over how to fact check President Duterte's televised late night speeches, and even a question of whether it should be streamed at all. What do you think the best way to approach this is? Balancing the obvious newsworthiness of the chief executive with the fact that these speeches have been littered with falsehoods. Anyone can just jump in.
Very challenging question, actually, I think, among journalists. The question of whether you even report it is something I think that every newsroom is grappling with, because the reality is this: the chief executive of the land, and there are things he says, and things he says are policy. So that's really something that's a very difficult question, if you ask me. But on the matter of fact checking, it's important that as he says that, you annotate. At the very least, you annotate. You need to outrightly label it if it's a falsehood, if it's a lie, if it's misleading, and so on. You cannot just be reporting, and it's very important that you stress that. Like, it's not that you're censoring the president, which was one of the points that was mentioned in that conversation, but it's about calling it out, calling out as it happens, a lie.
Ijo? You're still on mute.
I'm sorry. I think the gatekeeping function of the media also applies to live coverages, which includes live tweeting. But we have to differentiate between reporting what is said as is and presenting the news, because those are two different things. I think there's a danger in parroting everything that's spoken by government official, especially those who have a long list of dubious claims. But there's also danger in treating live tweets or live streams as the news itself or the final journalistic output. There has to be room for analysis. And I think we also have to develop a culture of readers or audiences who demands those analysis, which of course would be very difficult for a single journalist assigned to cover a late night coverage or speech to do. So while fact checking in live coverage should be part of standard newsroom practice, I think it should be a team effort. Like on the practical side, assigning 2 to 3 people to work on an event that other newsrooms had been doing. here in the Philippines. And this group could create a deeper analysis of the issues later on.
Yeah. For me, I think it's important that the people know when the president and any other people in power, when they're lying. Because what they say, especially the president, what he says translates into policy. Let's take, for example, his drug war figures, which since 2016 have been ever changing from 1.8 million to 3 to 7 to 8 million. And it has become the basis for a campaign that has turned into this bloody campaign now that has killed so many lives and affected so many families. So it's important that the people know when he is lying.
I think it's a very tricky decision-making process for the editors as well as the reporter. I do agree that while on the ground, it's very difficult to fact-check the president. If you've ever covered the speeches of the president, there's no single flow that the speech could go. It could go anywhere. And so as a reporter, if you're covering it, your priority is to catch everything that he says. So it's really difficult if on the ground you have to do the fact checking. It's different if, say, you're in the comforts of your own home and you have the luxury of playing back what the president said. Then you can go back and then you can freeze what his speech and probably fact check it on the spot. So, I mean, to the credit of reporters covering the president, there is that difficulty. But at the same time, there's also the responsibility for newsrooms, especially the editors, to see if this speech is worth airing live on nationwide TV. I guess we have come to that conclusion because we are in the middle of a pandemic and we're expecting the president, whatever the president says, will have an impact on our daily lives. Is he going to impose a lockdown again, or is it going to be relaxed? So that's what everyone's waiting for. But unfortunately, on both occasions, that's not what we've been hearing. So it's difficult because you cannot predict what the president will say. One journalist was pointing out, what if after you cut off, for example, the president, he says something important, then you miss the opportunity to cover it. So there is that difficult balancing act that's going to happen. What you can do probably is to fact check right after the speech aired, just to remind people that this is what he said, but this is what's really happening on the ground.
So I agree with everything that has been said here. I guess just drawing from our own newsroom experience, we've made that decision, I guess, since even before the 2016 campaign started. We started doing live coverage, live fact checking. It is quite not that it was a difficult decision because we really found no other way to do it. But what we found difficult was operationalizing it. As Mike said, there are many real-time challenges, not just on the ground, but even for digital newsrooms where work and platforms are ever multiplying. There are also different audiences to respond to or to think about, how to communicate them, how to make the message clearer to them. And now we encounter a president who's as Mike said, he can go touch on different topics, personal, also very offensive slurs in his speeches. And so, of course, at first, in the first years of his administration, we really found it we found it necessary to cover him, to show people that this is the kind of president that we have. This is how he is as a person. And so over time, we've also been learning not just how we can divide resources, but where our people, because we have a smaller newsroom. I think that's the problem also now, that even newsrooms that cover national beats are quite small. They really keep it lean, and so it's difficult also to where we're going to allocate our resources. And so, but it's a learning process. And I think now, if there's a demand for it, and we're actually seeing that demand, that clamor for this kind of reporting, then this is very, very much encouraging, because it's the kind of motivation that we all need in this very difficult profession.
Yeah, those are all really excellent points. And just picking up on that more broadly, how do you think that journalists should go about covering public officials who are themselves, the source of the disinformation? Just going beyond the president, but I'm thinking of, certain senators, certain congressmen, certain police officials who have a documented sort of pattern of lying or spreading falsehoods. How should journalists go about covering those individuals, especially if that is your beat and you're assigned to cover them? And I'd be interested in hearing maybe sometimes that you've dealt with this in your own work.
But if I can go ahead and answer that, I think we have to constantly challenge every statement that they have to say. I mean, if there is an opportunity to ask, if it's a press conference, then we ask. For instance, if a government official says this is something that we will do because according to the law, this is what supposedly his interpretation of the law says, then we can point out the specific provision and say, sir, I don't think that's what it says, or look at the language of the law. How do you reconcile this with your statements? Or if he has a certain policy recommendation, look at his previous actions, his previous, say, policy decisions, and say, why are you now saying this when a few years ago you were saying this? And again, I guess it's important to remind the viewers and also the readers constantly that there's been a trail of, let's say, flip-flopping, or maybe a record of backtracking on certain statements by this official, and it's just a matter of saying this is what happened. You don't necessarily have to, go against the person. Just say this is what happened before. Here is his policy statement now.
Matthew, I think a critical part of this, and really I do agree with Mike. I don't cover the field, just to be very clear about it anymore. It's been a while since I've been covering the field, but I could see the challenges in covering real time. Okay, but I think this is where you do your homework. You don't go to battle without studying the terrain, right? You actually go to when a journalist covers or does a coverage, you're actually going to battle in a way, because you're covering something. So you need to be very conscious of your context, of the context behind, like what is the current coverage, and then you anticipate what might be said. That is very important. In the live debates, for instance, which we did, fact-checking live debates during the 2016 elections, the 2019 elections, one of the things that we did beforehand, before the actual debate, was we put together all of these, we anticipate what will be discussed. We have anticipated what will be discussed, and then put together research that we can use to double check what's being said. And yeah, I agree, that's quite a lot of work, but it's necessary. Journalists cannot be going to a coverage without refreshing, without knowing what the laws are, like as Mike was saying, because if this law will be discussed, or this topic, this issue is going to be discussed, and you're not aware of what the topic is, like what's the background, what's the context, then you cannot give context, and you cannot obviously annotate responsibly.
I mean, similar with Verifiles, we don't do breaking news, so we aren't in the same situation as the others when facing disinformation as it comes in. But I think it's important that it gets to be pointed out in reporting, especially if it's a repeat claim, because this administration has the tendency to repeat their false claims. Like, for example, the presidential spokesperson Harry Roque has said that the country was the first to declare a lockdown, and the office of the president has repeated this at least 3 times. So if it's something like that, if it's something that you can fact check as it comes in, I think it's important that it be pointed out. I'm also just reminded of the Reuters digital news report that was released this June, that says, well, it's a survey from 40 countries, including the Philippines, and more than half, 52% said that they prefer that the news media report the statements this statements containing disinformation, because it suggests people would rather make the decisions for themselves. So I think it's important that we still report it, but we put it in context, or when something is false, we follow up with a fact check report.
I think I have come to accept the fact that journalists right now are really living in a world where there's a vicious repression of dissident opinion. So we have to really bring a healthy, rational sense of skepticism in everything that we do and in everything that we cover. State-sponsored disinformation, for example, it's very dangerous because it has more political and economic power to reach the masses. So when we try to uncover the truth, we have to take the side of where the disenfranchised, for example, or those who have no access to power. The media, as I see it, has also a tendency to represent only a limited spectrum of the debate in a certain issue, especially when you're pressed for time or you're running after deadlines. But I think the responsibility of the media there is to prevent the marginalization and eliminating authentic and rational critical discussion. And in order for us to do that, we have to include as many voices as possible in our stories. Because government side, or the voices of authorities, is only one side to every story. So we really have to take note of that and bring, and to always keep in mind the necessity of skepticism in our stories.
Yeah, those are all very good points. And it sort of reminds me that because of the climate that we are in now, there's sort of more demanded from us as journalists than there might have been even just a few years ago. And this is certainly a question that predates the current president, but is sort of even more urgent now. Do you feel like we need to be rethinking the traditional understanding of journalistic objectivity? And how have you sort of been approaching that in your own work?
Yeah, well, definitely. We really do have to rethink it. Uh, I guess the traditional, like coming from with a legacy arm, because we're part of this huge media conglomerate, right? And we're also part of this big one of the largest, if not the largest, print media venture. And so we're coming also from that tradition. um, and I think it's also true for most of the newsrooms today, say for a few such as Verifiles or Rappler that could actually set where they have begun, the kind of principles that they will have, or the kind of reporting. So they have the not just the free hand, but were able to start that way. For us, we're also coming from that traditional training, even not just in our newsrooms and in the culture, but also how we were trained back in school. Uh, of course, whenever objectivity was discussed, we would be taught that's not really something that is realistic. It's difficult to be objective when you are approaching a topic, because you have to have some sort of a bias for something, and a bias for principles, bias for human rights. And but how this has been interpreted, I'm very lucky. I'm coming from a very good journalistic training background, but it's also not true. And I've also gone around a few parts of the country and talked to also yeah, educators there, and they're having difficulty grasping this and how to translate it to how the concept of objectivity in teaching their own students in communication. How do they how would they be able to apply it in producing news? But I think it also has to start from our current practice now, that we have to identify as newsrooms, as individual journalists, what do we stand for, and who do we report for, because that was never objective. The truth is never objective after all.
Just to jump on Camille's point, It may be a cliche, but every time I write a story, I always ask myself, for whom am I writing for? So that's just what guides me in covering and writing every story ever since I started with journalism. But one of the first things that our journalism professors told us is that objectivity is a myth. And I do agree, because the media as an institution serves its purpose by selecting topics to cover, distributing concerns, framing issues, filtering information, or what we call agenda setting, focusing their analysis through emphasis, tone, and whole range of other techniques. So it's really entire system of filtering and gatekeeping. So clearly, objectivity won't really survive that kind of system. So for me, we just have to continuously ask questions whenever we're writing, even the smallest stories that we encounter. Whose opinions are we trying to get? Are we only depending on government sources, which is of course easier to do? Um, are we putting in as diverse voices as possible in our stories? So part of rethinking and understanding journalistic objectivity is to constantly updating or constantly improving our practice on the ground as individual journalists. And that, of course, translates to how the entire newsroom changes or innovates as well. But as long as at the core, as an individual journalist, you know what you're doing, you know who you're writing for, I think that alone is an important tool in um, maintaining the credibility of the media, especially traditional media.
I think we also have to break away from the usual mindset of he said, she said, or false equivalence of, you know, to show that you're fair. You allot supposedly equal time to different sides, but that doesn't work. And an age where, of course, the state has vast resources to monopolize the discussion, to issue press releases, to actually dictate what goes on in the news, then you have to break that. You cannot just rely on what the government says. You have to check if it's true. You have to check what's the basis or what could be the motivation for this particular statement. And I guess you cannot just give them equal time. You have to go beyond that. You have to find out what is the truth here. Is it really raining outside, or is it just really a myth? I mean, you have to look at what really is happening, and you cannot just rely on what one person is saying. And this is very, very important at a time where the discussion on social media is very much dictated by what government officials are also saying. I mean, we have seen instances when the comments on social media are actually echoing the official stand, or it's the other way around. The official statements are actually echoing what social media is saying. So you now have to ask: is this really the official statement, or is this called from whatever everyone is saying on social media? So you have to break that mold. It cannot just be he said, she said.
I I do agree with what was said so far. I want to stress this. Uh, Objectivity, that notion of objectivity and or an interpretation of that objectivity has actually been weaponized, if you ask me, against journalists. It's always repeated. I've seen this in many of the social media posts that we have been examining as part of our research on misinformation. And what has been what the way it is being interpreted is like by being impartial, so as Mike said, by allotting equal space for what certain parties say versus the others. You are being objective, but actually the notion of objectivity, and there's been quite a lot of discussion about this also in the US elections, is that you apply rigor to your coverage. You don't just report what has been said, but you actually double check things. Then you point out when things are wrong. So there's a method to that process. Remember, journalism is that discipline of verification. That's at the heart of the at the heart of it. And being a discipline of verification, you cannot be impartial. You are actually partial for facts, for partial for truth. So if somebody lies, it's wrong to say you're being objective by not calling out a lie, right? It's actually wrong and not being true to your calling as a journalist.
Yeah, I think those are all really great points. And what strikes me about your answers is sort of a lot of this goes beyond what we do as individual journalists and sort of making a decision as an organization, as a newsroom about how to approach that. That piece of it is also incredibly important. And sort of taking off from there, how do you think that newsrooms should be innovating and adapting their coverage or their strategies to account for, not just the proliferation of disinformation, but the very real threat of fascism to press freedom?
Sorry, let me try to take that on. So there's quite a lot of innovation out there, I'm sure, but one of the things that we need to learn to start doing as in the Philippines really is to form consensus among newsrooms in relation to known facts and known truths. Because if we don't do that, then you're actually like, the problem with the Philippine media, if you ask me, is that we're so which is I think true also of all other media and industries in other countries. Like that level of competitiveness is there. I mean, and we compete, which is fine, and it's part of the whole value of that freedom of the press, because you then let a thousand flowers bloom, right? But the problem with just letting that competition rule the show and not like considering consensus also on certain established truths is that then you're not drumbeating that, you're not pointing out that, hey, this is a lie that has been made like several times and it's being reiterated over and over again. Newsrooms need to say that and like in unison. It cannot be like one newsroom just saying it now and then another newsroom. It needs to be there, needs to be reiterated.
Let me just jump in also. I've always questioned how newsrooms have arranged their reporting according to beats. And I have nothing against, the concept of it, the beat system, because we've seen some incredible reporting also coming from the beats. Like we have examples of Mike here. And also the beats are where the news the news agenda is also presented. The reporters are able to challenge the authorities and powers that be and question them. And actually, the concept of it is to put the agenda of the people, concerns of the concerns of the public there as a forum. So the beats are very important venues in a democracy. But how we've actually approached beats as newsrooms, as media organizations, I guess, in the past decade, in a way to also cope with the economic demands on us, is that we just jump from one topic to the next, and there are many things that fall into the cracks there. The gaps that are not covered when one person is just focused on Malacanang, for example, and even if that topic is also taken up in another beat, these topics are not really put together. But there was a practice. There's been a long practice that has been employed in print journalism for a long time. They call it wrapping a story, but it's just coming from that beat. And so the challenge now is for individual journalists to actually step aside, step back, and look at what are really the topics here that matter, and what kind of other information that I have to collate, question, and focus it there. So it's really the interdisciplinary kind of reporting, and for us, it has done, it works so far in terms of making some issues, focusing on some issues, following them up, by not really putting so much importance to that territorial aspect of the practice of the beats. So it's also important then to have beats that are not just the territory, or not just on Duterte, for example, but if Duterte is saying something about human rights, or saying something about foreign policy or the rule of law, let the reporters have specializations on that, jump in and cover that aspect of what the president is saying. It's not just the Malacanang reporter. So that has, we've seen that as some sort of a formula also for us, especially with few resources at hand.
I agree with Camille. I think it was evident in the recent speech of the president. And just to cite as an example, for example, Raptors Pia Ranada was covering the speech of the president. She was fact checking, but at the same time, their reporter covering the vice president was also tweeting, was also fact checking. So that's an example of how reporters from different beats can actually work together in covering the speech of the president to make sure that all the statements are actually fact checked. Unfortunately, that's not the case with other news agencies. Usually, you have one reporter covering everything, and if it's in Malacanang, everything that the president says will be reported. If it's in the Senate or in the House, everything that's being tackled about whether it's budget of another agency, that will be reported as well. But you do miss the kind of expertise that a person covering the beat will have, the stock knowledge that a person will have if you don't have him cover that particular aspect as well. That said, the difficulty here is that will you require now all your reporters to monitor all the speeches of the president, because you never know what the president will say. We never expected the president to say anything about Leni Robredo at the time he made the speech. So will we now require our reporters covering the vice president to be on standby every time the president makes a speech? And the same goes for the Senate, for the House, and probably the health department, where also, you have some controversies in the Department of Health. So that's a tricky question. How do you now manage your newsroom? Do you put your reporters on call? That's, I think the editors can answer.
Yeah, that's tough. That's all I can say. It's been tough. But yeah, there is some sort of rule that we follow. Of course, there's the one covering the president at that moment, and then the person also says this topic is assigned to you. This topic is assigned to you. Like there's that sort of informal conversation going on, informal coordination, just so people would be, the report would not just be breaking news in a he said she said format, but would actually harness whatever knowledge that you've had that you already have in the newsroom, the specializations that you've developed. But it's tricky on a day-to-day basis. People are just it's easy to get tired. It's easy to really get frustrated, especially now with so many platforms to handle, fewer hands to do so. Maybe Gemma also has some experience there.
Yeah, so for our part, what we try to do, because it's really tricky. Like the beat system has always been organized in location based, really, rather than thematic. What we did in the past few years is that we started doing these clusters, editorial clusters. Well, actually not just editorial clusters. It's not yet a perfect system, but basically you have different parts of the newsroom clustering around thematic areas. Like for instance, my cluster is digital media and democracy, looking at that the impact of media on democratic discourse. So that's my cluster, and that's basically looking at the information ecosystem. And what that means is that there's still the usual sections and units, but that's putting together various heads in a single thread, just so we're sharing information with each other, and that's helping guide coverage around particular issues. But I agree, it's hard to operationalize. We're still trying to perfect that process. We also have a governance cluster, for instance, because like it or not, you have all these different agencies and layers of government, and it's so hard to also perfect coverage around those. But the point of it is to have editors, then senior editors who are who have coverage, who have done coverage in various in these specific issues, being able to help and input and guide the coverage as it goes on. So it's still a work in progress, but that's what we're trying to do now.
Yeah, and I should also point out that, what's tricky here is that the speeches come in at about 11 p.m. or 12 midnight. So do you expect your reporters to stay up late each time the president says something? So
that's so true.
That should be banned altogether. It should not
watching real time. I just watch after.
That's right. It should not be normalized. Can't have a president's speech for midnight snack. It's not healthy.
Just to add, I agree with everything that's been said, but I think in order for newsrooms to truly innovate, especially traditional media, is to understand the institutional factors that set the boundaries for reporting and interpretation. Number one is corporate ownership, of course. Second, how the type of government we have influences how the major media frames and reports issues, more or less the way dominant forces want them reported, or what we call the chilling effect. So the newsroom really has to give their daily beat reporters a time to step back, or a time to reflect from the ground in order to look for openings. Because there are openings. There are openings for investigative reporting in whatever beat you handle. And there are people in the media who look for them and find them and write them effectively. So it's just giving the daily reporters a chance to really reflect on these expertise that they're supposed to have. Some of the best known investigative reporters are even more cynical about the media than media critics. So they just want to find ways to work within the system and present stories that matter to the public effectively. But that would require waiting for a time to do the legwork, to do the rigorous research. So it's really how the newsroom enables them to do that. They could look for an opening, but if the newsroom really won't give them the opportunity to pound on that opening, then newsrooms won't really innovate that much. Will still be stuck on the traditional daily beat reporting.
If I may also just add, and I agree with everyone, what everyone has said in the call. I think it's also important to involve our readers in the process, in that we empower them we teach them to value truthfulness. We teach them to value accuracy, to think critically. Because when our readers are empowered with information, when they're empowered to think critically, then that also keeps us in check, to become more objective, or like to include more context or truthfulness to be truthful and to have context in our reporting. And having citizens involved, apart from keeping us as journalists in check, that also makes them keep politicians or any people in power in check as well.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important point. However great our reporting is, it doesn't matter if it reaches a limited audience, or if the people, that we are supposed to be serving, it's a very limited slice of the population. And I think I'm interested in knowing your thoughts on, how can news outlets do a better job of reaching more people, particularly people who maybe are not inclined to be reading mainstream news outlets. How can we do a better job of expanding, what Ijo mentioned earlier, sort of the tent of who our journalism is for?
Let me get a let me try that. But you know what, Matthew, that's a very good question. That's what I worry about. That's what I am thinking about every single day. That's what I also think about before I sleep. Are you reaching the kind of audience that we want to reach? Is this a critical mass? Is this the audience who will have a say, whose say will have a weight in the next elections? Are we communicating to them the way that they would understand us? Are they tired of how the news sounds? So all I have are questions, really. So that's a question you pose for me. I'm gonna pose more questions. So this is something that we've been exploring here and there in little experiments. Some have been successful, some not so. We will try to experiment more, because there are some signs that the little experiments that do succeed can lead us to something better in how we present information to them. But I think it is also very necessary in this day and age. How can our news be more, it can reach more people than fake news would ever reach? Perhaps the language and the packaging of false information is more attractive, or or better. I won't really say better, but more attractive, or more, they get more reactions than real journalism. And that is a concern, because of course there's also the matter of algorithms favoring this kind of packaging for false information. But at the same time, what lessons can we learn, and how false information communicate to people, and get the best bits of it and make it news, make it true, make it the kind of reporting that will help them as citizens in their own decision making every day. So yeah, more questions also.
I really agree with Camille that that's something that we go to sleep with every day. Like that's the holy grail, like reaching the unconvinced, reaching the mass based. But I think there are two factors there. One is capacity, also, because well, we have to we have to um, we have to contend with capacity. Like what can we do? I mean, what can we with our current resources do? But at the same time, there's also creativity. So it's really like it's something that we challenge ourselves with all the time. What are the limits? Because like on one, you have to understand, for instance, attention. When you're talking about this, you need to understand the dynamics around the attention span. So like what will get people to actually view things? And the reality is, even in broadcast, for instance, media that are really like significant in terms of reach, there are types of content that get a lot of attention versus certain types of content, right? And people will always gravitate towards, people fighting or brawling. That's a challenge for us, versus like, some very boring thing like learn about how the budget affects you, right? I mean, like, that's my coverage. And to be honest, I have learned to live with lack of attention in that very important topic. So I think those are the things that we need to contend with. And we try as much as possible to be creative there. But and I think this is where there are things that need to go beyond just the journalists and having other sectors come in also. So just as an example, for instance, when we did our fact checks, we've been getting a lot of these feedback that, hey, why don't you translate your fact checks into Filipino? But even if we translate them into Filipino, if it's in text, will people read? That's a big question. So lately we've been experimenting with why not convert it to video that's Taglish? We're still struggling, okay? Because you're talking here about video content on YouTube that already have amassed like millions of views versus like a fact check that has only a few thousand views, and that's really the holy grail we're trying to crack. So it's I think we need to do more experiments, but that's really like you need to take that thing with a grain of salt. At the end of the day, it's also about people learning to pay attention to things as well that need attention. So there's really quite a lot of thinking around that needs to happen.
Some foreign media have actually been experimenting with recent developments in technology. Aside from delving into Instagram, for example, you have some international media actually putting up stories on YouTube, on Facebook, on IG, or now on Twitter, just in an attempt to get more readers, get more viewers to their content. That could be one, but I think what's happening now in the Philippines is that you have to differentiate the kind of audience that you have on social media with the kind of audience that we have on broadcast. Because usually on broadcast, you just turn the TV on and then you have the news on your background. You could just listen in if you want to. You could select what you want to tune in, but it's there. So the content is there and the audience reception is passive. So there's an advantage to that in a sense that you get to have them listen to what you're reporting on. Whereas on social media, it tends to be more active. The engagement it will have to depend on the interest of the reader, and will also depend on the algorithm for that particular social media. So it's trickier to try to get their attention there, because if you have incendiary language, if you have juicy content coming from, say, bloggers who tend to favor a particular side, you actually lose out, because your bland content is not as appealing as their incendiary content. And this is one aspect actually that was already talked about in 2016. There was a move for PCOO to actually accredit bloggers. But the bloggers, part of that move was actually to regulate the kind of content that they post, which means they can't post offensive language. And they objected to that. You know, the reason that they cited by one pro-government blogger, it will diminish their reach, because that's what people are looking for in their content, the ability to actually cuss, to call people names. So they actually acknowledge that part of their appeal is to be able to offer offensive content to their core audience. So that's problematic for me. That's something that we have to deal with as traditional social media, as traditional media.
So those are all really, really great points. And I just have one more question before we move to the Q&A. Oh, sure. Yes.
Just to add to the previous
sure. Go ahead.
Sorry. So your question was, how can journalists do a better job of reaching more people? Theoretically, we have to remove the barriers to free and open discussion. And of course, that includes having an unrestrained and healthy media, and having citizens, or providing under-resourced people with the communication skills and technologies that they need to tell their own stories and stick their own claims for social justice, for example. And that includes instruction and media literacy. When you look at agenda setting media, the so-called agenda setting media that we have now, most of them are part of corporate media, or are linked to big corporations or big conglomerates. So they have the capacity to go to the provinces, send their correspondents, or have their own views there. but smaller media units don't have that power, that don't have that economic power. So it's really a balance of maintaining or fighting the repression of the press and enabling journalists and newsrooms to have a fair advantage in covering the news. And at the same time, informing citizens as well by giving them the agency to stake their own claims.
If I may add as well, you know, with social media, there's a lot of ways that newsrooms can innovate, but especially with small newsrooms, there's the challenge of resources and manpower. I mean, you have Twitter, Instagram, you have fleets now on Twitter, as well as TikTok, which some newsrooms are at least that I know of in the US are trying to get into, to get news content into, or fact checks into. But that, I think it's important to also see that that only reaches a certain demographic, you know, maybe middle class people, young people, or millennials. But here in the Philippines, who else are we missing out on reaching? Maybe people in the provinces. Like, one barrier we have is that we have tons of languages. And you know, in Verifiles, we only have English articles, and sometimes we translate them into Filipino, but just those two languages. So there might be a need to try to get out more content in other languages, or have a, I mean, there's a lot of good community media. The challenge though is that they are being attacked as well. They're being red tagged or terrorist tagged. But yeah, I think there can be an effort if resources and manpower allows for us to reach more people by coming up with content in other languages. I mean, just what Ijo said, media literacy is important. And we came out with a video tutorial series recently on how to fact check. And apart from English and Filipino, we translated it to Cebuano and Ilocano as well, you know, to try to break that barrier as well. Thank you.
So I have one more question before we move to the Q&A portion. So just a reminder to attendees, you can use the Q&A box on Zoom or the comment function on Facebook if you have questions for our panelists. But just as a last question for me, you know, there's this flawed concept of the journalist as this very sort of altruistic being, and it's something that has resulted in, you know, this dearth of conversations about how we can create better working conditions for journalists. And I'm interested in knowing, you know, what are things that you think newsrooms or the government could do that would make journalists better protected, and that could better ensure the welfare of journalists, particularly amid increasing threats to journalists now. Maybe we can start with our newsroom leaders.
Okay, I don't think it should come from, it can come from government, right? There are certain legislations that we have been pushing as a community for a long time, the FOI for one, right? There are also, I think the reforms also have to start within newsrooms. That the corporations also have to recognize that we don't just exist for interests that are for profit. That when you hire a journalist, you build a newsroom, that you decide to become a media owner, there are consequences of that. And the first consequence is that these journalists will not report to you in the very first place. Our first stakeholder is the public, our readers. Our first responsibility is to democracy and participation, etc. Providing information that would be useful to them as human beings, useful to how they also make their own decisions, democratic or otherwise. And then after that, perhaps the economics. So maybe there is also, you know, it's happening around the world. The fault is also in how we have structured the media as part of, you know, capitalists systems that we expect them also to be off profit first and foremost. At the same time, we have found also this particular system, this business model to be the most successful and the most, kumbaga, sustainable, because we've seen the news media that are commercial, that have, those are the ones that have been there for a long time. So it needs a lot of study, it needs a lot of also of reflection, and then also we can educate also the demand, because we are also responding to the people that we serve, to the readers, whatever they also ask of us. Of course, we have to protect whatever we think are the principles that have to guard our reporting, no matter the demand otherwise. But we also, it's still the ideal reader would still be someone who has the values of democracy, especially liberal democracy, and knows, and a reader that knows how to look at the news and say, this is something that has to be done, and this is something that we should stop doing. But you only get that, I guess, from also an educated citizen, or someone not, not formally educated, but someone who has the values of a citizen, who knows the constitution, knows his or her rights, etc.
If I may answer, so a big part of the thing that we need to start doing is to start educating precisely the public that information, verified information has its costs. Okay. First of all, there's logistics to it. There's personnel. Who are actually have to gather the information, double check it against other sources of information, just so that you are sure that this is true. So there's when with the internet, with the growth of blogging and platforms, that value to information has somehow become, or content, that was somehow diluted, and that is no longer appreciated. So you lost, like, for instance, the print publications in effect are struggling with circulation, and people are not paying for digital, and that not yet to the extent that it will actually allow digital to take off and finance that kind of operation. And people need to understand that. People need to understand that that's a discipline. There are people who actually have families behind them who they need to support, and therefore those people need to be paid. And they're not just volunteers. It cannot just be a volunteer operation, because like when you start to not think, when you don't think of it as a professional operation, then that's when you go to through that slippery slope. There's I think what needs to happen is some sort of an education of the public to audience around that theme. And this is not just the journalists that need to understand and do this, but others as well, other stakeholders in democracies as well, because we try as much as possible. Like Rappler is a journalist controlled organization, and the struggle has always been, continues to be, what kind of business model works. Do you rely on grants? Do you rely on philanthropy? Or is it possible to have to generate that kind of stakeholdership in people who value news, who value information that is verified?
Jumping off from what Ms. Gemma said about involving the people, it's really important that we have, us as the press, have the support of the people, because really, if we think about it, the power of the press comes from the people, and our protection comes from the people as well. Because we're here, we're performing a role to give information to the citizens for them to make decisions by themselves. But if we aren't here, if we're being shut down, we're being attacked, we're not being able to put out that information that they need, um, then there would be backlash from the people themselves, asking to bring back these news organizations, or to fight for these news organizations. But we also have, but this power from the people, it's something that we also need to earn and to maintain. And how we do that is that we continue to practice responsible journalism. We always we correct when we make faults, and we become transparent in our reports.
Yeah, so I think the business and funding model of that would be most effective for journalists is really the Goldilocks question. That would be the topic of a whole other webinar. But I think now we can move on to the Q&A portion for today's event. We have a lot of questions in the Q&A box, and I think in the interest of time, maybe one or two panelists can take each question that we have here. Just to start off, we have from Al Alegre. He's asking, maybe some of the panelists can also describe and comment on the state's institutional infrastructure that enables the disinformation. So for example, the Office of the Spokesperson, PCOO, State Info Ecosystem, such as PIA, RTVM, PTV4. Would anyone like to take this question?
Right, I'll start with that. Well, I think the difficulty, especially now that we're in the pandemic, is that press conferences are now not in person. They've now been converted to Zoom. There was a time when it was just a one-way, it wasn't a press conference at all, because they filter the kind of questions that are being answered. So you can't even ask follow-up questions. Now they do have Zoom conferences that you can ask and follow up. But again, the release of information is heavily reliant on government officials giving you data, giving you pictures, even if it's not their turf. But you rely on them to provide you with information, and there's a problem with that setup because you want to protect access, but at the same time want to report on them. So how do you balance that? Do you crop a person from the photo at the risk of not being able to get more pictures in the future? Do you not credit that person with the photo, and then the next thing you know, you won't have pictures in the coming days? So how do you balance that, and how can you critically report on them if you rely on them for information? I agree that although there are efforts to have that FOI bill here, it hasn't been working. I think there was an EO that was released, but reality is that it's not being implemented. So you still rely on your access to be able to get certain information, and that becomes tricky because not all government officials appreciate your role. There are those who will not provide you with information because they feel that you've antagonized them, when in reality, you're just doing your job. So government officials should understand that whatever information they give us is not out of we don't owe them a sense of gratitude for them providing us the information. It's actually part of their work. And we're also doing our work, but being critical about what they do.
We also have another question here about engaging social media companies. And I think Celine touched on this earlier, but our attendees asking, its extraordinary reach, its interactivity, and its toxicity and hyperpartisanship. What are your organization's strategies for engaging and deploying and also calling out social media platforms?
I think there are two dimensions to it. One is working in tandem. Like we've always, at Rappler, we've always described this as critical collaboration, meaning you work with them to help them improve the platform, and that's what the fact check collaboration, for instance, the third party fact check collaboration where Verifiles and Raptor are part of that collaboration. But at the same time, it's also about looking at and investigating how disinformation, and hate speech circulate in these platforms, and how whether initiatives that they're doing, or even the primary algorithms that work that are powering up these platforms, how are these actually like affecting democratic discourse. That those are all part of what needs to be done. It needs to be in layers.
Yeah, and there are shortcomings. There are things that can still be improved, but these initiatives by platforms that are trying to lessen the reach of disinformation on their platforms, or to label it, I think that's a step forward, rather than totally not doing anything at all. Yeah.
So we have a question here for Camille specifically. The attendee says, Philstar is known not only for its savage fact-check tweets that provide context to public official statements, but also for its meme tweets, which do not only provide the news, but also somehow a reaction about the news. So the attendee wants to know, but there are comments saying this is already a way of editorializing the reporting of the news. Is that your goal, to readily provide sort of a commentary on the news using the memes, or was it a strategy to engage the audience?
Right. Yeah. Well, first of all, I hope Philstar gets more known beyond just the tweets. You know, you maybe click the links there, read the reports behind it. You'll see that Philstar is just more than the what do you call savage tweets. And that's what that is actually what surprised me. You know, the first tweets about that were off this style came from the newsroom, came from the desk. And it was surprising for us that people reacted this way when we started fact checking, and they would interpret it as that we were being savage, or we were throwing shade. But really, there wasn't really that intention. It's just really to contrast one statement that has been said with the statement that was said before by the same person, by the same official. And so we didn't really have, that kind of intention. But of course, this is a new medium. Twitter is a different environment. We, as a news organization, we also did make a decision on how we can experiment on the kind of reporting we could do on Twitter, and we did push the envelope. One thing that we started using was memes. I think the very first one was when we were reporting about an idea that was being pushed in Congress about renaming an airport in the middle of a pandemic. Everyone else was on lockdown. And so one meme just captured all the other things that we could write about it. Like, this is said in the middle of a pandemic. This is floated as even a priority. That legislators are thinking about this at this time when they should be thinking about the budget and stimulus, like that. So it just captured all the other parts of reporting in one meme. Now, of course, the subsequent parts of that was, of course, experimentation, pushing the boundaries, seeing how people also would react. So there was an intentional part of it, and there was also the unintentional. And we do learn, we do listen to feedback. There were voices then that suggested that we can't go up to this limit, and it's a learning experience. This is a new digital might be already here. We've been in digital for a few decades now, a couple of decades, but it's still very much new. It's newer than radio. It's been there for centuries. Film, etc., all the media. So this is an aspect of how will the news look like in the future. So we can take these experiments also with a lot of thought, also with a grain of salt, and then that will help us shape how we can envision the news as we go forward.
So we have a question from John Coronel, who says, what is the future of traditional media, which is run by trained professionals, given the growing influence of new media? It's more democratic, yes, but it is susceptible to unverified and worse, fake news. He says, I know the traditional media practitioners are using social media as well, but they seem to be suffering in terms of following and reach. and even the perceived lack of credibility having been demonized by trolls. So do we have someone who wants to take that? The future, I guess, of traditional media.
What's the future? It's so hard to see. Yeah.
Let me try, Matt. Miss Gemma
Do
is
you
going
have
to
a
answer.
future?
No, what I'm saying is the future is how we shape it to be, 'di ba? I mean, like at the end of the day, um that direction is something we all struggle towards, and hopefully something comes out of the struggle. But it really all depends. There's quite a lot of factors. So first, the journalists need to stay strong and to stay true to the discipline. And the discipline again is verification. At the end of it is really like making sure that facts, everything, the public discourse is all based on facts. Calling out lies is part of it. Moving towards the future requires not just the effort of the journalists, but everybody else, including various sectors of society, really, because the journalists are not the only one shaping this future. The others also are. Like it's a very dynamic space, and the audience is part of that space.
Ijo, you wanted to say something earlier?
Yeah. I think the proliferation of disinformation in social media, for example, is a democratic challenge. I see that as a democratic challenge. So if the media, vital institutions of democracy, as they are, as we see ourselves, operate in a way that is not open to democratic challenge, for me, that is a democratic deficit too, that we must counter also. Media consumption in itself is not just the route to engagement, it is only part of a broader balance that we have to create, consumption and civic engagement within people's lives. So the remedy really is to make media production more open to citizen intervention, or widening the circuit of influence over the means of communication, like veering from mere press releases or authority figures. Um, it's also important to always maintain an ethics of care into practice. I've always believed that as journalists, we have to maintain a sympathetic understanding of what we're covering. Like there has to be an institutional ethics of care on the topics that we cover. Because that way we could build solidarity then. We can bank on the stories that a news outlet has produced if we are having the similar ethics of care. So aside from that, I think storytelling really feeds back to the ways in which we recognize and respect each other as individuals, whether we are journalists or not. So it is vital not to lose sight of that basic point, really, to create stories and to have multiplicity of voices in our stories, so that the basic injustice of keeping our citizens in the dark or not putting people in power and dominant forces in check would be addressed through our journalism.
If I could just chip in, Matt, if I were to be optimistic, I'd like to think that eventually, if we just stick to our profession, to our ethics, the public will probably just see that in times of, say, calamity, disaster, when information is really important, then they go back to us, and they can always rely on us to provide accurate information. But I guess that's more, just being optimistic, because the reality is that you can see this in the United States. The more that we allow social media to just get ruled by trolls, the society becomes polarized. It's already polarized as it is, but if that trend continues, when we allow false information to proliferate, I'm afraid that we reach a point where people will not just will just rely on their will just believe what they want to believe in, and regardless of whether it's traditional media, regardless of whether that's a blogger who's saying it, it's just an echo chamber that's going to happen if we allow this trend of misinformation proliferating on social media.
Yeah, and sort of related to that, we have a question from Jay Beltran, who says, how can the media better protect the public from lies, given that there are far too many venues being used for the proliferation of fake news? He says TikTok and YouTube are now emerging as major sources of these types of propaganda. How can we counter it?
Give us the budget that they're giving to all these trolls, then we can counter them properly. You know,
Magandang idea yan.
All right. So I think that's it. Give us also, you know, a lot of power over Facebook. I'm kidding. I think Gemma can also share their efforts. This is also an area where we also admire Rappler. Yeah.
I think you're still
efforts. Sorry. Yeah, we this is an area where we admire Rappler's efforts on how they're making the public more aware of these systems. Well, we've been mentioning fact checking over and over, and I think that's something that we not just have to keep doing, but also keep on developing. You know, different formats. If we have to do it on TikTok, then we'll do it on TikTok. But again,
Balancing.
I don't know how to dance.
Hindi ako marunong mag-dance.
How do you fact check? By yummy of Justin Bieber, right? So I don't know. We still have to see. But yeah, you know, we're crossing over these platforms where the audience is. You also will try to be there, but there's so many challenges, so many limitations as well.
I agree with Camille there. At the end of the day, every channel means another person actually devoting time to understanding the channel and how things work within the channel. For instance, Facebook works a certain way, right? And they tune their algorithm so that it's really like optimized towards engagement, right? It's optimized to looking at what makes you click, what makes you engage, right? YouTube works differently, and understanding the differences there is part of understanding how to counter that, and that takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. So I guess it's we try, and we'll try to be there. I don't know if we can be on TikTok. I don't want to dance on TikTok. I'd rather leave that to some cabinet secretaries. But but I mean, but you know, I'm like at the end of the day, so this is also why engaging with the platforms as well is very critical, because at the end of the day, it's important engaging and studying the platforms and writing about what they're doing and how their algorithms affect public discourse is very important, because at the end of the day, we cannot, it's not just about our content. Again, I just want to point that out. I can write, I can do I tried doing a lot of things with budget, as I mentioned, with budget reporting. We did visualizations, we did video, and so on. We did games around budget and understanding the budget. But at the end of the day, it's about like it's a fight for attention. And if certain platforms are crafted or designed in such a way that it's really just leveraging attention and just triggering attention without consideration of what impact that has on public discourse, on public policy, on democracy, then what journalists do wouldn't matter at the end of the day. So I mean, like what we do, even the fact checking that we do, that won't matter at the end of the day if the primary algorithms running these systems are biased towards that. So it's important actually, and I mean, it's hard because it's very technical, and you need to like look at a lot of data, a lot of, you need to observe how it's working. We need to do it, and the public needs to be aware of how this is working, and yeah, and how it's affecting that entire fabric, that entire conversation.
If I may just very quickly chime in, I mean, to the
Sure.
question of how to protect the public from lies. I mean, as Camille mentioned, if we had the budget, then we would be able to fact check more stuff, hire more people to do the fact checking. But while that's not here yet, we can continue fact checking as much content as we can, as our resources, manpower allow. And as well, it's important that we empower again the readers with the skill, with the know-how, how to do the fact checking themselves, because it's journalists shouldn't be the only ones fact checking anymore. Everybody should be able to know how to do fact checking. So it's important that we teach them the tools that we use, how to spot misinformation, which there are initiatives to do that by media organizations. Yeah, Verifiles included. So thank you.
I wonder if we have a regular media beat or having a regular media beat will also help, because that will also mean you have an extra set of eyes looking at how the press or journalists are actually covering or asking questions. So if, say, there was an interview with the president and you think that the questions were softball questions, then if you have someone from the press actually pointing that out, what should have been asked, that might have, educate the people. But I fear that in the Philippines, that might actually lead to competition and network wars, or probably one agency saying, why are you fact checking us? You can't fact check your fellow news organization. I think we have to elevate the kind of discourse that we're having in Philippine media, the ability to be open to criticisms by peers. In the way that, in the United States, you can just use a video that aired on Fox and critique on CNN, for example, and that's perfectly fine because it's part of democracy. So I hope we can do that here.
Yeah, I think all of those are really, really great points. And I think to all of our attendees here, if you have the means, please do subscribe to, media outlets that you feel are doing important, meaningful work. It's incredibly important. We have an interesting question here about source-reporter relationships. We have an attendee who's asking, how is your relationship with those media personnel in the president's office who have biases and take his side? Do they cover his tracks and filter information when they edit and cut his speeches and videos?
I'm not covering the president. So.
You're the nearest thing to that, Mike.
No, I mean, fortunately, we have people in Malacanang who are covering him. So we have access to people who are close to him who can get the information. Sometimes they reply to me, sometimes they don't, but that's life. You can't please everyone with the kind of reporting that you have, but you just trust that. I'm fortunate that in the Department of Justice and in the Supreme Court, the government officials there are actually open-minded in a sense that they can ask them hard questions and they won't take it against you because they know, they recognize this is part of your job. But I'm not sure if that's the case in Malacanang. If asking the hard questions can actually get you kicked out of the press corps. I'm not quite sure if that's the case.
So we have a lot of attendees who are really interested just in one of the first things we discussed about, covering these live addresses that President Duterte does. One of them is asking, are editors open to adopting a policy where press cons being covered live will be cut off in cases of false claims? Or flashing a warning that a claim is false and that the audience should stand by for clarifications.
I think we discussed that earlier, but the question really is like how and again it's about annotation. I guess we need to be more creative in how the annotation actually happens in live coverages. Again, I think this is a balance again of resources also and capacity, but we should do it. It's important that we do it.
So we have a question from Jose Carlos. He's asking, what kind of audiences are likely to believe a fake news story? And how can we help them know the truth without offending them?
So one thing I realize is actually it cuts across. I've always looked like we've always thought like for instance the baby boomers, because they're not familiar with the platform, they're also prey to that. But there's also a lot of educated people that I see that sometimes share false claims or even content from dubious sites that we that Celine and I have obsessed about. and and I think it's I think we are all prey to misinformation in various ways, and I think the thing here is you have to understand it's misinforming content or propaganda. It's really designed to a lot of it is designed to trigger impulsive behavior, really, like and a lot of it is because of the emotions it evokes, and sometimes like anger, for instance, is one of the most triggering emotions. So I think it is important that we understand that all of us can actually fall prey to it, and we need to then be conscious of it, and then make sure that when something is triggering our more like for instance anger, irrational anger on our part, for instance, or like when we're so angry, don't share because most likely you probably need to check it first. So it's really important that we do that. I don't want to say that one particular segment of the population is the moment we start thinking that there's just one segment of the population that's prey to this, we start losing sight of the fact that we can actually be prey to that also, and therefore need to check ourselves as well.
Yeah, just seconding Miss Gemma that it cuts across because there's confirmation bias, you know, with a lot of information going around social media. People tend to not act rationally. People tend to act based on their emotions. They tend to share or like based on their emotions, preconceived notions. But the question is, there was a question: how can we help them know the truth without offending them? I mean, you don't have to be antagonizing toward a person that shared false news. You can just let the facts speak for themselves. You know, just give a link to the person, or if you know this person personally, you can message them so that you know hindi parang pinapahiya mo siya or you're shaming them on social media.
So we have a question here from Reniel Gundran for Mike. Reniel says, with all the facts and truth presented here today, what will be the new face of Mediascape after this pandemic? How do we solidify aspects of ethical news gathering and news reporting as well?
Is that addressed to me particularly?
It was.
It's hard to say. There are a lot of lessons that we can learn from this pandemic. First, there was initial reassessment of how we can cover safely. You know, we put our safety first so that we could cover more. and then we moved into a phase of trying to get more information from the government. The initial approach was to try to get the information out to help more people address the pandemic. And so there was certain level of cooperation in the announcements that are being made. But I guess we have to evolve and see whether the response was actually sufficient. Did they actually make the right calls in addressing the pandemic? And I'm not sure if we're making that right amount of critical assessment at the moment, but maybe in time we can probably look back and say, look, what did the government do in March, in April, in June, while the numbers were rising, and we can probably have a clearer vision. It's 2020. As for the future after this pandemic, if we have a future, well, I guess certain measures will have to be taken into consideration by the editors and by the newsroom leaders on how to better address this. What safety precautionary measures are you going to take? How can you be more discerning when it comes to covering government officials? And to what extent do you actually look at also helping those who actually need help in times of pandemic or disasters? I'm not quite sure really how it will look like. I hope that we can be more critical and discerning when that time comes. But as it is, I don't know actually when this pandemic will end, probably 2 or 3 years. There's enough time for us to actually think and do some soul searching, how we can do a better job as journalists when it comes to emergency crisis such as this one.
So we have another question here that's related to the pandemic. We have an attendee who's asking, I would like to hear your thoughts on the varying public reactions toward the coverage of the pandemic and government response. In light of different political leanings or levels of support for the current administration, what are the larger implications of different interpretations and thoughts on media coverage? So I guess the underlying question here is sort of how do we grapple with the fact that different audiences will be interpreting the same story in different ways?
I'm trying to figure out what exactly the focus of the question is.
Me too.
Yeah. If the focus is like what's the implication on the press? So one of the things that I think happened during the pandemic also was that the pandemic highlighted the need for information. Crisis always does, the need for verified information, because it connects to life. It connects to actually to something very basic, survival. Like, how do I survive? So it's important, therefore, that I get verified information, that I really up to date on what's happening. So in a way, that was actually an opportunity for the press to show, for journalists to show their value in society. So we try to do that. But I mean, something to be. I'm not sure really like how the if that was the goal of the question. The larger thing, and this may be beyond the pandemic, is that these different things, how the press is regarded, for instance, it's important to look at the narratives that are being seeded. When people sow distrust in the press, because I mean, on one hand, these are doubt in the press. There's also truth to some of the to some. It's also based on certain truths. There's really there are really gaps in coverage. There are really like times when there's corruption as well in the press, right? I mean, things like that. But the larger discourse there is, and particularly if they're not talking specifics, like who did what, the larger discourse becomes like, okay, don't believe them because, I'm not sure if I try to hit it both ways. First, the pandemic is an opportunity to highlight why people need verified, credible information. But at the same time, with that doubt being seeded and continuously being seeded, it's important to watch that. It's important to watch that messaging and counter that messaging, and always challenge the messaging, because that is actually like showing further distrust in verified information that the press is communicating, and something that could have an impact on society in the long run.
So we have time for just one more question from the audience, but the speakers could continue to answer the questions directly on the Q&A box. So for our last question, we have this question from an attendee asking, what is your take on people using dummy or fake accounts, spreading facts, or the sole purpose of these accounts is to correct fake news? And would you advise this for people to protect their identities?
It's I get the danger of calling other people out, and there might be people who might feel that they are it's not safe to speak out, but it's also a slippery slope, and we need to be very conscious about like that use um accounts that are not transparency. I mean, knowing where the message is coming from, is always good in a democratic debate. Like being able to contextualize where the message comes from is important. So in fact, this is the reason why journalists are supposed to disclose, diba? Like newsrooms are supposed to disclose their sponsors, like who funded them. We're holding journalists to account by those measures. Like we're supposed to tell the public these things. But if you are not holding other information communicators to the same standards, and they're able to build a following based on the standards, how sure are we that the same platforms that are the same channels of communication will not be used for other means? So it's really important to think that through. Like, not accountability is a big part of this, like disclosure is a big part of this whole ecosystem. And that's why, in fact, as fact checkers, for instance, Verifiles and Rappler went through that process with IFC, and where we had to have these disclosures, like the methodology, all of those things have to be open to the public for scrutiny. Now, if you're talking of fake accounts, if you're talking of accounts that whose voices we don't know the origins of those voices, then I mean, there's that possibility of that being used for other means.
Yeah, and to add to that, I mean, I wouldn't outrightly discourage or encourage using dummy accounts, but it's important to keep in mind that if you're having an actual person, a real account would be more credible than an anonymous account. Yeah, so that's my take on it.
I'd just like to point out also that even in the time of pandemic, we really had to deal with propaganda like that. The danger with that is it created an illusion that we have a framework for debate, especially when we're clueless about where the pandemic will take us or what's really going on in the world. So the question really is, who are the people that we are admitting into mainstream discussion? Because if we're admitting certain groups into the mainstream discussion, we are alienating other groups. We also have to take note of who are we alienating. And the solution to that, really, to prevent alienation of other groups, is to constantly amplify the truth. That's all that we could do. That's the most powerful thing that we could do, to amplify the truth in any chance that we can.
So those are all really, really great points. And so before we close the discussion, maybe we could hear just some final remarks from each panelist. And I guess just to end on a sort of forward-looking note, I'm interested in knowing, what about journalism or the press here makes you hopeful about the future of journalism in the country, in the Philippines? So maybe we could start with Camille, then Mike, then Ijo, Celine, and then Gemma.
I'm hopeful that we are now starting to see an audience that is trying to demand from us a bit more to do the kind of reporting that is called for in this, in the age of, you could say, illiberal, eroding liberal values and principles. My hope is also for journalists to respond to these demands, to listen more to how the audiences are the things that they're asking from us, to rethink some methods. Of course, not to abandon the values, not to abandon the principles, the standards and ethics that we've hold ourselves to, but to be open to rethink, reshape, and move forward.
I agree with Camille. There's now more people, well, at least in social media, who are now asking for better coverage from traditional media, and that could only be better for us because you have to step up. We cannot just be complacent and do what we've been used to. Now that there are people actually looking at what we do, and that's a wake-up call. But I also I'm hopeful that there's also better discussion now about better wages, better working conditions for journalists. That is also very important to keep people who are good at what they do in this profession. We've seen a lot of people leave this profession, work for PR because, well, sadly, this profession doesn't, pay so well, and it cannot sustain possibly the kind of life that they want for themselves. And that's sad because we're losing talent, we're losing skill that we need to cover this country. And also, but with all the things that's been happening, I'm just hopeful that a lot of people are still committed to this profession. With the shutdown of ABS-CBN, for example, many of us could have chosen to leave and look for greener pastures and probably a more stable working environment. But I'm inspired by the example that my colleagues have been showing, braving the storm to cover the story of every Filipino that the country deserves to hear, despite the uncertainty of the working conditions that we are in. And for that, I'm hopeful that no matter what happens, there will always be journalists who will do their job, regardless of the administration, regardless of the catastrophe or pandemic that we're going to face in the future.
Ijo?
Yes, I'm hopeful that more people will realize how press freedom is connected to other rights that we're enjoying. To define the state of press freedom means looking at various facets of society. The first being emphasizing the value of unrestricted free press and freedom of expression for all, not just for journalists. Second, highlighting democracy's deficits and actually emphasizing the role of informed citizens and the responsibility of the press to serve them or serve the public interest. And third, the importance of communication in relation to other human rights. So to holistically define the state of press freedom, we need to look at the different facets of society as well. Without a free, open, diverse, and robust media, democratic social change is virtually impossible, I think. So advocating for a free press and social justice are intertwined. They will rise or fall together. So we need to really deal with them as a whole and not just an isolated battle among us journalists.
For me, I'm hopeful that local media organizations continue to adapt even despite the challenges that we continue to face. Like, ABS-CBN really is an inspiration, that despite the shutdown, they have managed to adapt and go to YouTube, to FB Live to continue reporting. And they even reached, if I'm not mistaken, 10 million subscribers on YouTube. And that's really great news. And because, news or truthful information, factual information, it's like water for people. People will keep on looking for it, even when it's, when it's taken away. So I am hopeful for that. And yeah, I would just like to end on a note that I really believe everybody can and should be a fact checker. So I really hope the people can are able to be more critical readers and use their skills on fact checking when they see content surfacing on social media.
Who's next? Is that me, na? Okay.
Yeah.
I was keeping track of. I'm hopeful. So what makes me hopeful? The fact that this conversation is happening in a public space with multiple newsrooms represented makes me hopeful, actually. And the fact that there seems to be a growing consensus also among journalists that there's a role for public interest, accountability journalism and the fact and that in public interest accountability journalism is important. Calling people out for lies is important. That's a big development. I mean, I think in the past I've been part of a lot of these conversations in the past, and they've always been like things that happen beyond. I mean, not public conversations. So this is a big development. The other thing that makes me hopeful really is among the audience there's this realization. I think there's this growing realizations, it seems, that there is that this type of journalism is important, and that this is actually what journalism is about. I think that's one thing that I realized from we've been doing these webinars, and people were actually going to these webinars. There's teachers, there's students, and they're all hungry for that for inputs. They're actually trying to learn this space. That is to me very powerful and very encouraging, and that bodes a lot for the future.
Well, thank you so much again to all of our panelists for such a rich discussion. Journalism has always been essential to the work of democracy building, but I don't think there's ever been a more urgent time for it. And you are all at the forefront of this. So thank you again for sharing all these great insights. I believe for those of you who are on Zoom, a poll is going to be flashing on screen. So please let us know your thoughts on today's event. And then as mentioned at the start of the program, FNF has some exciting news. So I will now turn my screen over to the FNF PH Project Associate, Rosel Lazaro.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Thank you to all our speakers. Let me just share my screen. Okay, good morning, everyone. I won't hold you too long, tanghali na din, but we would like to invite you to the To Be Human Human Rights Film Special. This is a project in cooperation with CCP, European Union, and Commission on Human Rights in celebration of the Human Rights Week. So it is a free film screening on December 4 to 13 on the CCP online platform via Vimeo. And then we will have a talkback session on December 9, 2020, 4 p.m. Annually, except this year, because of the pandemic, Friedrich Naumann Foundation conducts a short film competition. So in this film screening, they will be featuring 2018 entries, winners of the FNF Freedom movie. So we hope to see you there. Again, that's December 4 to 13, talkback session on December 9, 4 p.m. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Rosel, and thanks again to all of our attendees. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.